And so with that, I want to move into some sort of specific cultures that have become relevant here. And let's talk about taxes for a minute, because as you say, there's sort of the public's take that you should tax the guy behind the tree. And then there's what increasingly appears to be the dominant take in the Republican Party, which is that you should tax nobody at all, ever, under any circumstances. And so, David, I want to read you a couple quotes here. The first one is from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, and it was a couple months ago, and he said, "There is no evidence whatsoever that the Bush tax cuts actually diminished revenue. They increased revenue because of the vibrancy of these tax cuts in the economy." And Boehner, Speaker Boehner, of course, recently said that tax increases of any kind were, quote, off the table. And what I want to ask you here is, what is difficult to discern in these comments is, are they reflections of a negotiating position? Or is this the authentic culture of the Republican Party now, that it is so sort of anti-tax that it really sort of, to some degree, doesn't believe in the relationship between taxes and the deficit, at least in the sort of mechanical way that most people do? And that, as such, it's not a negotiating position. It's a deep theory that, if abrogated, they feel can't be abrogated because it would both harm the growth and, in the long run, harm the deficit.
Yeah, I guess from my private conversations with many Republicans, it is not consciously a negotiating position. It is a deep theory and a deeply held conviction. Now, that doesn't mean it's inflexible. If they were presented with some serious entitlement cuts and some serious spending cuts, would they then be willing to move off their theory? And I think if there was some gigantic offer on the table, they would move off that theory. And so, you know, I look at this general problem. It's not a wonk problem. It's a political problem. It's getting 1 million different people, or at least 10 or 15 different stakeholder groups, to cross certain Rubicons. I thought Simpson Bowles crossed a Rubicon by widening the field of debate. I thought Paul Ryan crossed a Rubicon by getting Republicans to think about entitlements. But then the other Republicans have to cross that tax Rubicon, and the Democrats, and Obama has to cross a Rubicon that'll say that seniors and the middle class is going to have to take a spending hit. And if you can get one group to cross a Rubicon, I think the Republicans would come off that Rubicon and cross that tax threshold if they felt the offer was good enough. But it's sequencing those Rubicon crossings that's the core political problem.
And do you have a particular belief about what would make an offer good enough?
You know, I think if there was a serious, if there was a spending cap, I don't think that's going to happen. If there was a spending cap, that would be so mouthwatering they'd cross the Rubicon. If there was a serious entitlement offer, a Medicare offer, they would cross it. The disturbing thing to me, and I'm very pessimistic today about the prospects, I had a lot of Republicans talking to me, a lot of Republican senators looking at this fight between Grover Norquist and Coburn. And for those, I'm sure you all know the fight, but essentially Coburn said, I won't raise tax rates because I signed your pledge, Grover, but I want to raise revenue by closing loopholes. And Grover said, no, you can't raise either. And I had a number of Republicans come up to me and say, hey, I signed that pledge, but I'd love Coburn to win that fight. And as I understand it, Coburn has maybe have lost that fight. And so, you know, I think they're more locked into the no new taxes forever, no new tax revenue forever position more than they were a week or two ago. But as I say, it's a conviction, and I think they'd be willing to move it if the circumstance were right.
And Senator Simpson, one of the things the Fiscal Commission did, or recommended doing rather, was to raise the retirement age in Social Security slightly, just by a year or so. And one of the interesting, I think, I don't want to call it a disconnect, but tensions, is that when you poll very specifically on things like Social Security, you do begin to see a bit of a gap open up between sort of people in DC, particularly policy folks in DC, and the public. When you directly poll the public and ask them, would you prefer to see Social Security or Medicare, their revenue gaps or their spending gaps closed through tax increases or raising the retirement age and doing similar benefit cuts, tax increases tend to dominate those polls. But in Washington, you have a real sort of affection, or I think it's almost a consensus position, that raising the retirement age makes sense. And what worries me when I look at that is that in Washington, it seems to me that people work long past the retirement age. They like their jobs. They like what they do. You pretty much have to carry people out of the U.S. Senate. Conversely, in the country, people don't retire at age 65. They retire at age 62. They retire on average immediately. So do you think that there's a difference between a significant difference, if you really sit down and explained it to people, between what the public would like to do on entitlements and what elites would like to do on entitlements? And if so, do you think that that is part of the gridlock, that the two sides simply don't agree on what the solution should be, even if they agree on the problem?
Well, first of all, there's a wonderful Lincoln phrase, enthrall. And if the American public remain or get to enthrall with Grover Norquist and the AARP, you haven't got a chance. We won't make it at all. If the American people are in thrall to Grover Norquist, some guy just wandering around in the swamps, taking a pledge from people when America was flush, and then pushing people like Orrin Hatch off the cliff as if he were a commie. I mean, what kind of a nut is this guy? But he's tough, and he and I say these things face to face. It's a glorious thing. He's as PO'd at me as I am at him. But at least we talk. But the AARP, I mean, come. If you can't raise the retirement age to 68 by the year 2050 and people can't get their things in order by then, if you can't understand that when I was a freshman at the University of Wyoming, there were 17 people paying into the system and one taking out, and today there are 3 people paying in and 1 taking out. If you can't understand that it was never set up as a retirement program, it was an income supplement, which became a retirement. If you can't understand it was never structured to handle disability insurance, it couldn't exist with that burden on it. If you can't understand it didn't take care of kids at 22 going to college, we can't make it. And now the great sharpshooters are out there, the Cat Food Commission, Cats and all those guys, using these distorted figures. And I always say, look, if you torture statistics long enough, eventually they'll confess. But I'll tell you, if you can't correct Social Security like we suggested, taking care of the most fragile people, the people who can't work past 62, the handicapped, all of that, we've done all that, taking older old and adding 5%, changing the chain CPI, lifting the wages to 190. If you can't get that done, you won't get anything else done at all. And I always say to people, what do you love? Well, I love education, and I love the environment, and I love this. I said, great. Then don't touch Medicare, and it will simply on automatic pilot wipe out every bit of that discretionary program. I promise. That's what we learned. And tax expenditures, for God's sake, $1.1 trillion. No oversight, no nothing. We said get rid of them. And then give a tax rate of, 8% from 0 to 70 grand, and 14% from 70 to 210, and 23 for everything over. Well, let me tell you, if you think there's distortion now, you better pray for Joe Biden and that crew. And I trust Joe Biden. I've known him for 35 years. You better hope it works. If it doesn't, dig a trench, and your kids will be picking grit with the chickens.
Senator, I'd like to push you on this for a moment. Because so when the Congressional Budget Office, and I don't mean to be a sharpshooter, when the CBO comes out, they have this big chart with 30-some ways to fix Social Security. And in your conversations, and you've been, I know, going around the country and talking to a lot of folks, and I know you've read a lot of the same polls I have, do you think that folks in Washington who skew educated, the folks in these conversations who skew educated, who skew affluent, do you think that they prefer a different set of solutions? A different set of solutions makes sense to them than to other people, than to the broader mass of the public? And if so, do you think that has been part of a contributor to the difficulty we've had pushing forward on Social Security? Because Social Security, I mean, we all agree, I think, that Medicare is very difficult. But Social Security is mechanical. It's which of the solutions you want to implement. It's not quite as much a conceptual problem. But do you think do you think there's a possible disconnect between the people in these conversations and the people who vote for the folks in these conversations that has become one of the impediments to reform?
Look at me.
Yes, sir.
We don't have any problem out in America when Erskine and I go about the country, alone or separately. We can get an idiot audience for 50 minutes and get a standing ovation because you don't have to use charts. You don't have to go into GDP versus the old percentage. revenue versus GDP, historical figures. Just tell them if you spend more than you earn, you lose your butt. And if you spend $1 and borrow 41 cents, you got to be stupid. And that's your government today. And yesterday it was 40 cents, just a few months ago. Now it's 41. Every buck we spend, we borrow 41 cents. Now, you don't do that in your own home. There's no need to talk about the masses and what they understand. They understand that perfectly. Because in their own home, they would be stupid if they spent $1 and borrowed 41 cents. So there we are. There's no mystery. You can use all the obfuscation, all the opaqueness, but if they can't understand that, then, you know, there's nothing you or I or anybody at this table or anywhere else can tell them.
All right. And so let's go on to Dave Cody's. What I want to ask you, I've made really bad life decisions. And so I spend a lot of time with healthcare policy experts. And the thing that I find frustrates them more than anything is that if there are any axioms in that particular field of study, it is that the placement of your employer in between you and your healthcare has been bad probably for everybody. It's been a driver of cost in the system because people are much further away from the actual cost of their healthcare. It's been an incredible burden on employers. It's contributed to the fracturing of the system nationally. And it seems like moving past that would be a win-win. I mean, and some of the most sort of eloquent voices for employers today, like the Committee for Economic Development, have released report after report begging the corporate community, the business community, to step up and say, listen, we need a solution. It can look a lot of different ways, but we need to get past the employer-based healthcare system. But when we went through the Affordable Care Act debate, and even going on until today, there's an immense status quo bias that the business community tends to exhibit. They want to keep the tax break the way it is. They want to keep their healthcare arrangements the way they are. They want to stay right there in the middle of the healthcare system. They don't want the type of root and branch reform that so many people think we need. And so my question to you, simply, and please just answer it in a moment or so, is why? Why? It's a big question, but why do they want it this way?
I wouldn't say that we want it that way, and I can only really speak for myself here, but I would say, first, I would completely agree. We have a system that currently rewards inefficiency and ineffectiveness. However, I would say that most of us, harking back to a comment that was made earlier, if you say this is a real problem, we need government to get in there and permanently be a part of this and fix it, our general reaction is going to be, okay, let's keep it like it is. Right? That's not generally a good place to go because over time, it's likely not going to work in our view. So I really am a believer that the system is very ineffective. We do not reward quality, for example. A lot of hospitals, doctors who would go bankrupt on their own because of an inefficient, ineffective business are allowed to thrive or continue doing okay. And even trying to get basic data, for example, on one hospital versus another in their quality, difficult to get. And I'd like to be able to start structuring reimbursement based upon the quality of the outcome. And we're starting to have discussions with our own employees, for example, about, do you want to get your heart operation from the guy who does 6 a week? Or do you want to go to the guy who says, oh man, I've always wanted to do one of these things, right? And you start having that kind of conversation and they start paying more attention to it. They never really did before. So I'd say it's more of a general queasiness with how do you feel about government getting in and permanently fixing something than anything else.